You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and today we are here with a fascinating interview with Emily Faulconer. She's the head winemaker and technical director of Viñedos Familia Chadwick, most famously known for Seña and their Viñedo Chadwick wines, but they also produce wines from a number of estates. We have a deep dive interview with Emily that I actually got to conduct in person. We not only had an interview, but we did a tasting as well. We got to taste the 2009, 2020, and 2021 Señas together, as well as the 2016 and 2018 Viñedo Chadwick Cabernet Sauvignon. And it was really great to taste these wines across their vintages, see how they develop over time and at different stages in their life cycle. And Emily is just a fascinating character. So we'll get to a little bit more about her before the interview. But ahead of the interview, I wanted to check in, make sure everybody had a great 4th of July and share a story from my own past weekend. I was up visiting my in-laws in the Bay Area and actually got to fulfill one of my Bay Area wine tasting goals, I guess you would call it, or something I've always wanted to do in the Bay Area. You may be thinking, oh, what is that? Maybe go visit Ridge and go up to the Montebello Vineyards or go all the way up to Sonoma or Napa. But no, it is to go to Livermore, California. Why Livermore? The Wente family is based there. It is one of the oldest kind of family producing wine families. It is one of the most well-known and one of the oldest winemaking families in the United States. And they are most famously known, you might have heard this when you went tasting really at many wineries throughout the US, for their Wente clone of Chardonnay. They were actually the first producer to introduce Chardonnay to the United States in 1912. And since then, cuttings from that vineyard have spread throughout the country. You'll see them all over in Napa and Sonoma and Oregon. It's a very popular clone, and I guarantee you now that you've heard it, you'll be looking out for the Wente clone. And that was one of the reasons I went. I wanted to drive around, see where these vines originated, check out the vineyards. And while we were doing the tasting, our host shared a little bit more information than I had expected about Sauvignon Blanc as well. And after he shared a little bit of info, I came back and dug in and did some more research myself. And there's a fascinating history of American-grown Sauvignon Blanc that started in Livermore, AVA as well. I'll just run you guys through what I've learned so far. So the first Sauvignon Blanc was planted by Charles Wetmore in 1882 in Livermore. Now, this was interesting. Obviously, this is well before Chardonnay, but this was part of an approach to try to make something like a Sauterne. These were cuttings that were rumored to have come from Yquem. They were accompanied by Semillon, and basically they were trying to replicate the Sauterne style wine. So Charles Wetmore brought these vines over. He planted them. Another guy by the name of Louis Mell also got a hold of some of these cuttings and planted some about the same time. And they just continued on. During Prohibition, a lot of great varieties fell out of fashion. People were looking for easy to grow varieties that didn't really need much upkeep just due to lower demand for drinking wine in general, obviously with Prohibition going on. And during this time, the Wente family actually helped support and buy grapes from the Louis Mell vineyard of Sauvignon Blanc. They were using the grapes to make sacramental wine. So the Wente family can basically also be looked upon as a family that helped preserve Sauvignon Blanc grown in the United States during this hard time. But later down the line, after buying grapes from this vineyard in the 20s and 30s, they actually ended up just buying the vineyard in 1940 and continuing to grow and bottle this wine as Sauvignon Blanc. Now, interestingly enough, this is the next layer that I didn't even contemplate when I first heard this when we were at our tasting, is that this clone of Sauvignon Blanc, which was grown in what is now called the Louis Mell Vineyard, was actually the very first Sauvignon Blanc clone that was cataloged at UC Davis. In 1958, they submitted clones of the Sauvignon Blanc to be reviewed and cataloged at UC Davis. This is in the early days of varieties actually being cataloged. So it became known as UCD1. And this variety was then propagated and sent throughout the United States and is now today one of the most widely planted Sauvignon Blanc clones in the United States. But it doesn't end there. There's still more. This clone is actually the most widely planted variety in a number of global wine growing regions, including the famous New Zealand. It is the most widely grown Sauvignon Blanc clone in New Zealand, Chile, as well as South Africa, which I find to be fascinating. So not only did the Wenties plant the first Chardonnay here in the United States in 1912, but they basically helped save Sauvignon Blanc grown in the States from going under during Prohibition and help propagate a clone that is now one of the most commonly used clones in the world and grown in many of the most famous Sauvignon Blanc regions in the New World right now, including New Zealand, Chile, South Africa, and the United States, which are all key regions when you think of New World Sauvignon Blanc aside from Australia. So I thought that was fascinating. I hope you guys enjoyed a little bit of that history as well. I certainly did not expect that. I wanted to go to the Wenti tasting just to see where Chardonnay originated in the United States and came out with all of the Sauvignon Blanc knowledge as well. So with that, we will transition on to the news for this week. And as that was a little bit of a long-winded explanation, we'll just do one news topic for this week. And it is on another white variety that I find very interesting, Trebbiano Spoletino. This article was originally published on Wine Searcher. Now, Trebbiano Spoletino, you guys may have heard of Trebbiano before. Throughout Italy, there's a number of different varieties or iterations, clones, if you will, of Trebbiano. There's a lot of different varieties that either are called Trebbiano and may not be genetically a Trebbiano variety. And many regions have what they call a Trebbiano de whatever from their region, like you think of Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, but they might be very different from each other. This variety, Trebbiano Spoletino, is an ancient variety that was grown in Umbria, an area of central Italy, right by Tuscany. And it is a very interesting variety that I had actually just come across in Robert Camuto's book, South of Somewhere. Really interesting book also if you guys want to learn a little bit more about Italian wine in a really engaging kind of storytelling manner. Really love the book South of Somewhere, so you guys should all check it out. In this book, he has an interview, or he actually goes and visits and tastes with Giampaolo Tabarini, who seems like a character, and goes and tastes a number of his wines, and they also go to check out his Trebbiano Spoletino vineyards. And one of the things that I found really interesting about these is that traditionally, Trebbiano Spoletino was grown in the really old wine growing style of letting vines run up a tree trunk, using that tree trunk as support for the main trunk of the grapevine, and then the arms would go out through the branches and the grapes would just hang down from the branches. And I thought this was a really interesting and romantic idea of grape growing, and I was really fascinated to hear that it was still going on in the world today. So there's grapes grown by Tabarini that are in this style. There's also another well-known producer named Paolo Bea, who was growing in Spoletino in this same style. And I've actually been lucky enough, after I read this, I really wanted to find some Spoletino. I went out and actually was able to find a bottle from Paolo Bea here in Los Angeles. I have his Arboreus bottling with a little bit of age on it. This is his skin contact expression of Spoletino, and I've been saving it and I'm really excited to try it. But when I saw this article, I was really pumped that kind of Trebbiano Spoletino is getting some spotlight, and I wanted everybody to be aware of it. However, you will read in Robert Camuto's book that with the rise of Trebbiano Spoletino, there are a lot of people planting what they're calling Trebbiano Spoletino, and they all might not be true genetic Spoletino. Apparently, Spoletino has a very unique form of grape bunches, and it's like a phallic shape, actually. He has really interesting descriptions from Tabarini in his book. But so while I am excited about more people learning about the grape variety, I am not looking forward to people capitalizing, as they do on some of these wine trends, and producing quote-unquote fake Spoletino. But definitely check out this article and read the book South of Somewhere. Now, and that is the news for today. We will transition on to our interview with Emily Faulconer. Again, it was great to be able to meet Emily in person. We had a great tasting. A little bit more on her background. Emily Faulconer is now the technical director at Viñedos Familia Chadwick. Different countries have different terms for different roles in the winery. Basically, what technical director means is she's the head winemaker of the whole Viñedos Familia Chadwick. There are winemakers at different estates who report to her. She ultimately goes around and oversees and has the final say on how most things are done. Under the whole umbrella, Viñedos Familia Chadwick, there is Errázuriz, Viñedo Chadwick, Seña, Calitera, and Arboleda. And she has independent folks working at a few of them and then directly oversees the winemaking at Viñedo Chadwick and Seña, and then again, oversees everybody else at the other three wineries and makes sure that the standards are being met and the quality and the style is being made, but a little bit more hands-off. And it's really exciting. She used to work at Arboleda for a little while before going to Viña Carmen. While she was at Viña Carmen, she elevated the whole game there. She made their Cabernet one of the most respected in Chile. And she also did some really fun experimenting where she made some biologically aged old vine Semillon, which I briefly talk about in the episode. It was really interesting to hear about how those came about. But she is now back as technical director at Viñedos Chadwick. And it was really cool to see and hear the difference between Viñedos Chadwick, which is a Cabernet Sauvignon, and Seña, which is a blend, including Bordeaux varieties, and the different approaches to each wine. It is very terroir driven. They really are driven by their place. When we ask her what she's looking forward to in the future, she's really focusing on just maintaining that quality of work in the vineyard. She's one of the superstars in Chilean winemaking right now. She was selected by 40 of her peers in the winemaking industry as Los Más Influyentes del Vino 2025. Basically one of the most influential person in wine in Chile in 2025, as voted on by her peers. So it was a great interview. Thanks again to Emily for making time while she was here in Los Angeles to taste with me. And thanks again to Covell for allowing us to taste at their wonderful sidebar. But now, without further ado, here is our interview with Emily Faulconer. Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hi, Billy. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is one of our first in-person interviews. I'm really excited you're up here all the way from Chile. Also, you recently were named one of the most influential people in Chilean wine by your peers.
Yeah, that was nice of them. It was actually quite touching. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really exciting. And to celebrate some of your success over the past year, you've been doing a little American tour here of some markets. Can you explain a little bit about your career and what's led you to this point and where you are today?
Yes, from the beginning.
High level. It doesn't have to be too detailed.
Okay, yes. I started working in wine 16 years ago to university because I wanted to be a winemaker. In Chile, to become a winemaker, you have to study agronomy, and then you specialize in viticulture and enology. And from day one, my first vintage in 2009, I really fell in love with this career, and been doing it ever since. I've worked most of my career in Chile. I did a few experiences abroad while I was trying to get a stable job and figure out what define myself and what kind of wine I wanted to make and learn like the basis. So I started here in California. I went a little bit to New Zealand. I was in Bordeaux and Saint-Emilion. And then I've always worked in Chile. I've worked in different regions. I've had quite a dynamic career. I've worked in several different places, and between south of Santiago, north, high altitude vineyard, bigger projects, smaller projects. Now I'm in Viñedos Familia Chadwick. I've been here now for 2 years, and excited. Yeah.
So you had worked with Viñedos Chadwick previously for a different one of their brands, but now you're going to be taking over basically full leadership of everything, the whole portfolio, but really focusing on Seña and Viñedo Chadwick as your personal hands-on work.
So. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so 10 years ago, in part of this dynamic route, I worked in Adaptation, which is one of the 5 brands of Viñedos Familia Chadwick, and I came back 2 years ago. So yes, it's correct what you're saying, as technical director of the group of these 5 brands, but directly responsible for these 2 wines at Seña and Viñedo Chadwick. Yeah.
Awesome. So in your time between the 2 Viñedo Chadwick periods, you worked at Carmen for a while.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how maybe some of the work there prepared you or changed your perspective on what you're doing now at Seña that you might not have done if you stayed with Viñedo Chadwick the whole time?
I think everything I've done has sort of set the stage to be able to take over these wines that are so emblematic for Chile, and it's a huge responsibility to take over this. And Carmen was a big step in that sense. I learned a lot. Carmen is a very traditional old brand in Chile, set in Maipo Valley, but it has vineyards and sources fruit from many different places in Chile. So while I was in Carmen, I had the opportunity to define style, make many different labels and types of wine. From Limarí, I developed, for example, a traditional method is sparkling wine based from Limarí. We had a portfolio working with small growers with the sort of heritage value grape varieties from all the way down in Itata. And then, for example, the Carmen Gold, which is the great wine of the portfolio, which is in the Alto Maipo. And so the possibility to work with many different grape varieties, and then also the teamwork, because Carmen is part of a big wine group called the Sump Group, and just even the corporate relationships. And so it was, in all sense of a word, in terms of leadership, technical side, and also like culturally, in terms of viticulture for Chile, it was very, very enriching for me.
Yeah, cool. I also thought it was cool that you did a biologically aged Semillon.
Yeah, I forgot about that one.
Kind of random, but like also right up my alley.
That one. Have you tasted the wine?
No, it sounds cool.
That was one of the sort of, when you, for me, it was testing my relationship with vulnerability, because I really like biologically aged wines, and we were working with the Semillon, and when I arrived, I thought this is a perfect wine to do a biologically aged white wine. And I was vulnerable when I had the results, and I thought it was really outstanding, but I didn't really dare to show it, but I put it out there, and luckily it created like difference of opinions. Some people hated it and some people just loved it. And for some wine critics, it's till today, they keep saying to me, this is my favorite white wine in Chile. And it was good for me and Carmen to be able to do that sort of thing. And it was beautiful.
Yeah, I think I don't know what the actual saying is, but they always say that's like the sign of creativity or something great if people have strong opinions on either side. Because if they're just in the middle, it's not interesting.
Yeah.
So when you were first approached about coming back to Viñedo Chadwick and Seña, how did that work? Was it just like something where they came out of the blue, or had you been working on it?
As I worked here before 10 years ago, Eduardo had at that time said to me, he was sad that I was leaving, because he said, we thought you had a, how do you say this in English? Like a room to grow professionally in the group. So when they first approached me, it wasn't a surprise, but yes, that was a formal technical director. They knew he was going to eventually leave because he had his personal project and he was going to move on. So they started to think of a transition for this role. And they invited me to be part of this. But I was having so much fun in Carmen developing these projects that it was actually a conversation of a few years before I actually took the job. Because it was all, with this type of wine and this type of role, everything has to be very well thought for. So it ended up being very organic in how it happened. So no, it didn't come out of the blue, and it was a really, I really thought about it, and I think they probably really thought about who was going to be the right person. So everything was very slow in the decision making. It wasn't like, hello, Emily, let's have an interview and start next month. We actually talked about this for a couple of years. Yeah. And actually all of last year, we worked hand in hand with Francisco to do the Passover, which was really good. Yeah.
So we'll dive in more onto like Seña and Viñedo Chadwick a little bit. Can you just talk a little bit about the full breadth of the portfolio real quick, because then I think our listeners heard us talk about brasseries. We sell some of that on the marketplace. But what else is there? What's the full portfolio look like?
So Viñedos Familia Chadwick is a portfolio of 5 different brands. 2 of them are Seña and Viñedo Chadwick, that I think we'll probably talk more in depth about those. But the mother brand is Errázuriz. Errázuriz was founded in 1870 by the Errázuriz family, and is a real classic in Chile. We're based in the Aconcagua Valley and in a place called Panquehue. So that's where the main winery is, and we're surrounded, obviously, by the vineyards that form the portfolio of wines of Errázuriz. It's a classic winery that has developed like best expression of Aconcagua in different labels. Trebbiano is one of the real heritage wines in Chile. We have Cai, which is a Cabernet, La Cumbre, and then we've also started with Errázuriz to explore towards the coast with other wines, beautiful Chardonnays and Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc. And then we also have a brand called Caliterra that started in the 90s in another valley called Colchagua, further south. You know all about it. And then the fifth brand is called Arboleda, which is the brand that I was in charge of 10 years ago. And Arboleda is one of Eduardo's personal projects. It's a very small boutique winery that is formed by wines that are made from the coastal side of the Aconcagua Valley. So we have some beautiful cool climate wines like Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Sauvignon Blanc. And also we have some red varietals, Cabernet, Carmener, and Syrah, that come from the coastal part of the Aconcagua Valley, which show like a different version from Errázuriz of the valley. Yeah.
Very, very cool. So with that full breadth, I think your expansive experience and also traveling around the world, working in different geographies and climates helps you understand the full breadth of the portfolio more?
Yes, definitely, like the role or the reason to be of each of the wines that we have. One of the things that I see behind each of our labels is that there's a reason for them to exist from the terroir. They're very terroir-driven wines. And of course, traveling, not only my experience doing the internships abroad, but also every year going abroad to visit different wine regions and tasting different wines. I think it has changed the wine scenario in Chile, because I'm not the only person that has done that. A lot of winemakers and wine growers have that has allowed us to have a lot of identity and authenticity behind each of the wines. And yes, of course, that makes a difference.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about these, and then we're going to get to tasting some of them, and we can talk about each one individually. But when you think about Seña and Viñedo Chadwick, I think the first things that come to mind for me, especially after talking to Eduardo, were like the heritage, the family connections, both with the Chadwick family and the Mondavi family with Seña, and then also just obviously the polo field story and the Chadwicks with Viñedo Chadwick. So can you talk a little bit about first to you what it means to carry on this heritage? Like you want to obviously put your mark on these wines, but also at the same time continue the legacy. And then maybe a little bit about what makes each one unique compared to each other.
Okay, so 3 good questions in one. But let's start with I get this question a lot: is what is going to be my input into the wines now that I'm taking over? I think I'm very comfortable with the style of the wines. I think what has been done in the last 30 years, 25, 30 years, depending which one, but of Eduardo's pathway with this type of wine has been amazing. And I feel that maybe for the last 7 years, or the style is very consistent. There's a lot of precision in the wine. The definition in the vineyard of the composition of grapes is very in tune with what we need to do as a wine. So I don't feel that we need to change stylistically. And I think that these wines are turning into classics, which is, with that, I'm going to answer the question saying that I feel that my responsibility now is how do we continue with this precision, this quality through time. So in that sense, for me, one of the most important things is how do we assure that the vineyard is going to be there in 50 years' time. Mm-hmm. So how do we make it sustainable in time? And so in that sense, everything we work for today is how do we give continuity to this. We have challenges that you probably don't see in the glass, because the wine is there, it's precise, the quality is consistent. But the challenges that we have, like climate change, how in terms of viticulture, Seña has been managed biodynamically since 2005, and it's a very respectful viticulture. But every year we're learning and adapting to how do we assure that we are going to have each of the individuals that are the vines in 50 years' time. So that is where our main focus is in the way of doing, to continue with the line of work that we come with, but we have to continually be learning and adapting for it to be there in 50 years' time or 60 or 70 for the future generations. There's a lot of, and that's why, in that sense, I'm really happy that Seña already has been working in that way, because to look at this vineyard as a whole, in the sense of like the biodynamic philosophy, we're very focused on soil health. We obviously have our own compost. We have animals in the vineyard. It's a very balanced viticulture. And in that way, we have started to implement that same way working for Viñedos Chadwick, because I think it is the only way to be able to assure balance and sustainability in the long run.
What are the stylistic, I guess, differences? Like they're both, rather than viewing, I think some people may not have heard Viñedo Chadwick as much as they have Seña, at least in the US. It's a little bit more popular, but it's not like a first wine and a second wine. They're very much just their distinct themselves.
So let's start with Seña, and then I'll tell you about Viñedo Chadwick. Seña is in the Aconcagua Valley. And as you mentioned, it's a project that started as a joint venture between Eduardo Chadwick and Roland Darby in the early 90s, with the idea of creating a wine that could stand side by side with the best wines of the world. So with that very clear intention, they chose a place in the Aconcagua Valley towards the coast. And it's a beautiful vineyard that is lying on a slope that has within the vineyard quite a lot of diversity. That is ideal to make a blend, because there are different locations, types of soil, altitude, expositions, that to be able to place at different grape varieties. In this case, it's a Bordeaux blend. The wine started the design as Cabernet Sauvignon based. Seña is always based between 50 to 60% Cabernet, and originally with Carmener, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and then eventually Malbec that came into the picture later on. We'll talk about that when we taste the wine. So it's a very classic wine, but for me, it's a modern classic Seña, because there was an intention to create this type of wine, and that's why it's called Seña, because it was like a sign towards excellence. And with time, a lot of things happen stylistically in the type of wine that we wanted to make, and the composition has merged to something slightly different. It's still a Bordeaux blend, but we call it with an Andean soul, because of the Carmener and the Malbec that today come into the blend. Malbec from the other side of the Andes. So yeah, Seña it's a very harmonic wine. The fact that it is a blend, it allows us to be very consistent stylistically year after year, because you can go adapting. We have different tools. We have over 100 different lots of wine. We really have identified the different aspects of the vineyards in wine, and it's very technical tasting when we do the blending to be able to achieve this type of wine. Viñedo Chadwick, on the other hand, I think is a classic. So when I talked about Seña, I said a modern classic, and I think I feel as Viñedo Chadwick is a real classic, coming from Puente Alto, which is a very, again, classic appellation for Chile that has had the match between Cabernet Sauvignon and the place for over 100 years. And also it's a family wine. Viñedo Chadwick, you threw in the polo field very briefly there, but it was a family home where Eduardo grew up. where his father used to have his polo field. He was a very important polo player in Chile. And when in the early 90s, they decided to plant the polo field, it has just been a story of success in terms of the wine, because it was just maybe a sure bet, because I think there's probably no other region in Chile that has validated itself with the match of Cabernet Sauvignon and site as Puente Alto. So since the very beginning, with the first vintage, it has performed beautifully, and it's a small vineyard of 15 hectares that year after year develops soft changes between the vintage characteristic, but the essence of Viñedo Chadwick is always like the finesse, elegance, and with this grape variety, that Cabernet Sauvignon is the most planted grape variety in Chile, the most planted grape variety in the world. But the sites that can achieve this type of Cabernet Sauvignon, counted with, I don't know, the fingers in my hands. It's so unique to be able to achieve like that finesse, elegance, and type of wine.
Perfect. Well, I think that's the perfect intro. I think now's a good time to taste.
Okay, fantastic.
So we have one of each Viñedo Chadwick and Seña poured. Can you share a little bit about the vintage that you poured for each, and then maybe something that's unique about that vintage, and maybe just the overall wine style as you were mentioning?
Yeah. Okay. So Seña 2021 is the wine that we are first tasting, our first pour. First of all, 2021 was an amazing vintage in Chile. It was slightly cooler than average, and as I said, Seña is already on a cooler place of the Aconcagua Valley, more towards the coast. We're 40 kilometers away from the Pacific Ocean, so we always have the impact of the Pacific. But and on top of that, the vintage was slightly cooler. Composition of 21 is how we're working today. Okay, so again, it is based on Cabernet Sauvignon. It's 50-something% Cabernet Sauvignon, and then the second most important grape variety is Malbec. So in the initial phases of Seña, there was no Malbec planted. It came in the third plantation phase in the early 2000s. And with time, we started to see that Malbec was a very beautiful, expressive wine, floral notes. The color is very purple and with a very lush character in the palate. So it started to replace the grape varieties like Cabernet Franc and Merlot. So going on with the composition of 21, so I said Cabernet Sauvignon, 50%, around 20% of Malbec, and then the third grape variety is Carmener. And that's where the Chilean sort of spice comes in. Carmener does very well in Seña. It's planted on the higher part of the vineyard, and it's a very silky palate. So we really like that component. And then the fourth component of 21 is a little bit of Petit Verdot, as like the tension, the acidity, bright color, and the color for the wine. Yeah. So stylistically, Seña 21 is very defined. It's a very pure wine. We have worked a lot towards purity, like the floral notes, the expressive nose, but also the balance that you taste in Seña and that we can get to through working through a blend. That is very beautiful. We have, through time, been working towards an earlier picking, aiming for alcohols that are in balance with the acidity, moving away from the sweetness. In the 21, it's very well accomplished in that sense.
So on the note of balance and acidity, are you looking, is there like a certain pH? Are you trying to bring it down? Was it like really high pH before? Is there a certain acid?
We went through a phase that we were picking later. Today, we're aiming for a picking window of alcohol that is between 13.5 and 14.
Okay.
Depending. Seña 21 is 14 alcohol because it was a cooler vintage and we had a very long hanging time. In those years, for the flavor profile, we can aim for a higher alcohol, maintaining the fresh fruit flavor.
Yeah.
When it's a warmer vintage, we pick earlier to be able to get the flavor profile, and it tends to have a low alcohol. So in a warmer vintage, it would be around 13.5.
Cool. And I guess you're picking on like Beaumet, or you're looking.
We look at the sugar levels, yes, but it's a lot of the berry tasting.
Yeah, a lot of berry.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then for those hotter years, in order to try to maximize hang time without obviously ruining acidity, are you adjusting the canopy in any way to help shade?
Yeah, we have adjusted our viticulture in terms of canopy management, irrigation, where we irrigate our vineyards to protect more the fruit, have a more, as a concept, a happier plant throughout the growing season,
Right.
to be able to have the grapes in a good condition towards the end of the season. As you say, especially in warmer seasons and with climate change, we've been seeing events of warmer vintages, and so we tend to have a better canopy. Before, back in the days in the Carbonets, we used to take off all the leaves to have the clusters really exposed. Now it's a completely different concept. How do we protect our clusters from radiation? We have a lot of radiation in Chile.
Yeah. So on that note, I was actually going to ask something else. But so the logic before was that Carmenere, when people thought it was Merlot or they were treating it differently, wasn't getting ripe enough, so it was super green. Now you're saying it was sitting too exposed. It was like sunburned almost.
Yeah.
So you're trying to find that balance between piercing ripeness and just phenolic general ripeness, or burned.
Yeah, with Carmenere, we've had to learn how to manage it to be able to have the real identity of Carmenere without burning the fruit or having it underripe.
Yeah.
Where we plant is an important factor, like the type of soil. We have to place Carmenere in a place where we can control its natural vigorous essence through viticulture and place. So we have it mostly on slopes that already restrains a little bit the plant, and in sites where we have a higher content of clay, and we manage irrigation with Carmenere. We try to restrict it a little bit so that at the end of the season, it's a little bit, it finishes growing in January, and then it has a long hanging time towards the end. But what we are looking for today in Carmenere is a proud Carmenere. We don't want a Carmenere that doesn't seem like Carmenere. So before we really understood where to plant it and how to manage it, we were trying to eliminate like pyrazine, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, pyrazine is part of the essence of Carmenere. And when it's in the right balance and the fruit manages to ripen properly, it can give like a really beautiful palette of aromas of floral notes, spices, and the tannin of the Carmenere is unbeatable. It's such a fine, polished profile. Yeah.
Looking at this wine, it is obviously, you're saying, pure, excellent right now, really beautiful nose, and the fruit really comes through and everything's really ripe. I think that's ripe in a good way. Not really ripe. People's perspectives of a lot of New World wines, especially South American, is that they're best drunk younger. How does Seña evolve over time? And I think we'll have an example actually that we'll be posting on social as well of us talking about an older wine next to a younger wine. But how can somebody expect Seña to evolve over time compared to maybe classic?
With a lot of confidence, I can say that Seña evolves beautifully in the bottle. We work for that, and the place allows it to happen. We have stacked vintages from the beginning since 95. That was the first vintage, and I would say that all of them have a beautiful expression today in the bottle. So, and especially how we're working today, like with the earlier picking, really respectful with the oak, our extraction technique in the winery is like almost like an infusion. It's very delicate winemaking. I would dare say that even that the current vintages that we're releasing are going to age even better than the ones that we were making 15, 20 years ago. And having said that, it's a question that people tend to ask a lot. How is this wine going to evolve?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a magic ball to be able to tell you that. But
Yep.
all I do have is that when we open a 20-year-old Seña today, it's showing beautifully. So I'm confident that the ones that we're making today are probably going to be as beautiful or even better, because experience is an important thing in terroir. And now we have 20 more years of experience, so it should be even better. And at least that is my bet.
Yeah. Especially with the work in the vineyard, the biodynamics and all of that come into more effect as well.
Exactly. And older vines also, which is also an important factor.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. Old vines have a bigger brain. So it's difficult to manipulate older vines because they're like stable. You can go, they resist much better heat waves. They resist much better, they're much more constant than younger vines. Younger vines are all over the place. And when it's too hot, they suffer. And when it's not, they thrive. And old vines are like constant. Yeah. You I don't know, we do measurements in the vineyard and you realize that it's not easy to poke your finger into.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's compare Seña and its balanced blended beauty, and then next to the Viñedo Chadwick, which is 100% Cabernet Sauvignon.
No, so we have the 18, which has 3% of Viticulture.
Okay, and that's
the
the same.
last 10 vintages have all a touch of Viticulture.
Is that fair? Again, color fixing and
Color fixing, acid. Yeah, exactly.
Cool. All right. Well, let's talk about this. What was the 2018 vintage?
18. It's going to sound like every vintage is outstanding in Chile, but I think if you ask me of the last 10 years, I would say that 18 is my favorite vintage, and 21 is up there also. 18, 20, 21, 22 are very, very good vintages. So 18 outstanding vintage for Chadwick. That is, again, now, so people understand, we're in the Maipo Valley in a place called Puente Alto, which is at the foot of the Andes. Be very clear, Seña is Aconcagua, more towards the coast. Chadwick, Maipo, more towards the Andes. Chadwick is almost like in the south part of Santiago, of the capital.
Yep.
Getting around Chile is really easy because it's so long and thin that literally you always know where the north is because you see the Andes. And so if you see the Andes to your right, you know that the north is that way.
Right.
It's,
Or the ocean's on your left.
Yeah, you always have this geological boundary that lets you know where you're standing. I've realized I'm traveling the wrong way in a bus because I looked out the window and suddenly I saw the Andes on the wrong side. And I thought, I should be traveling north and I'm traveling south. Anyway, going back to Viñedo Chadwick, 18, beautiful vintage. It was like a perfect vintage, everything in average throughout the season. And the balance that we find in the 18 is quite unique because we have like tension and the flesh of Cabernet Sauvignon, which I think is the two things that I really like in a wine. I want a wine to be tenser, to have the acidity, like the structure, but also one of the most important characteristics in Viñedo Chadwick is like the length, the texture, the polished tannin, the finesse. And I think to be able to get that finesse, we need a balance between those two things that we don't necessarily get every vintage. So it's a very like a complete ripening that happened. Yeah.
Awesome. I think that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask a little bit about, I guess, what you guys try to position these like your peer class for Viñedo Chadwick. Like we had the great tasting of Berlin, and I know Eduardo likes to go up and put Seña and Viñedo Chadwick up against the best wines in the world. When people are like thinking of these wines, what are some parallels? I'm not saying they're as good as other countries, but saying if you're looking at like Bordeaux, are these classified growth? Is that a good comparison?
It was a very interesting comparison because putting these wines up line against the great wines of the world, and for wine references, wine critics or wine journalists, people that knew what they were doing, they these wines came up in the top ranking. So that was a good thing. And if you ask me personally, we always see as a reference, for example, Chateau Margaux, like the finesse, the elegance, or Cheval Blanc. Yes, we see it as a reference, and I think when I said about Cabernet Sauvignon being the most planted grape variety in the world, you can count with your fingers places where Cab really shows in this way. And I feel Chadwick has something very authentic and unique in that sense. How one tends to think of Cabernet Sauvignon as a big grape variety, bold, but for me the great Cabernet Sauvignons are the opposite to that, are the delicate, almost fragile wines, but that they seem fragile, but they have a back personality that lifts them up, and for me, Chadwick has that as the great Cavs from the world too.
Yeah. I agree. I can see that there's definitely a level of finesse and floral aromatics and into your, I guess like finesse is the best word. I was gonna say delicacy, but there's not. It's like a powerful finesse, almost like I guess a ballerina in a way. You know?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. But I wouldn't be able to do it.
But so I think with that, not that Chile just recently has started making good wines, because obviously these wines have been great for a long time, but I feel like the world is just starting to come around and really recognize Chile as being on that top tier, especially like Wine Spectator putting a Chilean wine number one last year. Have you seen, when you're talking about Chilean wines to, you were just out in the market now or out and about, is there a different essence around it now? Do you find it easier to talk about it? Are people more open? How is the conversation?
We've been really pleasantly surprised in this trip of bumping into people that know about Chilean wine, high-end wines, because we've had the unfortunate sort of reputation to be, in Spanish we say, bueno, bonito, barato. That means good, pretty, and cheap. But I have, and obviously I work in fine wines, and I see Chile through completely different eyes. That we have the potential to make outstanding wines, but in tasting proved that we could. But I have a feeling that a select group in the market understand that from Chile and are seeing us as a country that can produce beautiful wines and validate that for us. And as you say, the fact that Melchor came out number one in the world, I think it's a huge thing for Chile. And it's nice to see the Melchor is walking distance from where Viña Chadwick is, but they're literally 50 meters away. So that's really, really good for Chile. And I think, but we have the challenge to communicate, to educate, to put wines out there. And they can for me, these wines can very comfortably be in the best wine lists in the world. Why not? And leave consumers very satisfied, which is the most important thing, that people that love wine, because this type of wine are for wine lovers. I feel very comfortable that we won't disappoint.
Awesome. We're wrapping up here. Looking forward, I know we've talked about like what you were thinking about impacting in terms of style with the wines, but what's on the roadmap for Seña and Viñedo Chadwick? Is it more just emphasizing that sustainability, biodynamics,
It's definitely in that sense, in the way we work, that we already work in that sense, but it's just never putting our arms down, and everything related to sustainability and agroecology, the biodynamics, and how we ensure that these vineyards will be there as they are or better than today. Yeah. That is sort of the pathway and our theme for our everyday working. Yeah.
Awesome.
Which sounds easy, but is the challenge for us every day. Yeah. Honestly.
Great. I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you, Billy. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for the invite.
All right. That was our interview with Emily Faulconer. I hope everybody learned more about Seña, Viñedo Chadwick, and the whole Viñedo Familia Chadwick portfolio. I highly recommend seeking out the vintages that we mentioned in the episode, but if you can't find those, any vintages of either Seña or Viñedo Chadwick will do. They are great wines. I highly recommend everybody seeks them out and try them. But for now, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another 5 questions on Friday and another full episode next week. Cheers.